Welcome to Communicating Mental Health in the Media. I am Sanaya Shikari, and I look forward to exploring the social experience of mental illness and the media's influence on this experience. Although there is a biological trajectory to mental illness, people are deeply affected by their social experiences. A major factor that affects how people live with a diagnosis of a mental disorder is the stigma. We will be using videos and readings that highlight the issues of mental health stigma within your own community. The aim of this course is to give you insight into the world of science journalism for the purpose of increasing empathy in mental health. In offering a course which gives you a live platform to share your work, you will be able to see the direct impact that science journalism can have on the broader community. In this lecture, we will be highlighting the history of mental health stigma in America as well as internationally. We will cover a variety of topics in this lecture to build the framework for this course. In this week's lecture, we will begin with an overview of the history of world psychiatry and then cover the topics of stigma and mental health. Before moving forward, think about in your community or country if mental illness is still stigmatized and in what ways. While this is not comprehensive or inclusive of all the factors contributing to the history of world psychiatry, I thought it would be meaningful to touch upon some of the key ways mental illness has been perceived by society through the ages. What we now consider to be mental illness belonged to the realm of the supernatural for those living in the ancient times. Priestly powers and magic dictated the earliest forms of medicine, ultimately blurring the line between the functions of a doctor and those of a priest or sorcerer. Magical powers were imbued in amulets and charms to lure out evil spirits from the bodies of the victims. One of the most primitive ways of dealing with the mental illness was a procedure called trepanation, where a hole was created in the skull in order to release the evil spirits trapped inside so as to cure the person. During the classical era, Hippocrates, father of medicine, believed that mental illness was caused by physiology, and this suffering could be cured with medicine and hygiene, not magic. The Greek physician Hippocrates was the first known to treat mental disorders as diseases to be understood in terms of disturbed physiology rather than reflections of the displeasure of gods or demonic possession. Family members cared for most people with mental illness in ancient times. Hippocrates used the notion of the harmony of humors, which, when in a state of imbalance, promised pain and suffering. In order to alleviate illness of the mind, the humors must be normalized. The Middle Ages was somewhat of a step back from Hippocratic ideology. With the rise of Christianity, faith healing took a downturn, and with that, mental illness began to be stigmatized as witchcraft. Through the centuries, mental illness became inexplicably intertwined with religion, as faith was believed to be the primary vehicle to recovery. Individuals with mental illness were considered to be wild beasts that needed to be confined and secluded from society in buildings commonly known as madhouses. The word lunatic stems from the belief that insanity was caused by a full moon at the time of a baby's birth. For the most part, Europeans allowed freedom of mental health patients as long as they were not dangerous. Some religious orders who cared for the physically sick also cared for the mentally ill. However, there were some brutal treatments for patients as well. For example, for demonic possessions, The patients were immersed in scalding hot water in an effort to draw out the demon from the body. Women who were accused of witchcraft were burnt at the stake. Doctors used hydrotherapy, in which they sprayed people suffering from emotional or mental illness with cold water from a hose to stimulate them. Patients were branded or poked with a red hot iron to bring them to their senses. In the 1600s, Europeans began to isolate people with mental illness, often housing them with the handicapped, vagrants, and delinquents. Those considered insane were increasingly treated inhumanely, chained to walls and kept in dungeons. The first attempts to classify psychiatric disease were made in the 18th century, and at the same time, restraint, starvation, close confinement, and other violent methods began to be supplanted by more humane treatment. In the late 1700s, after the French Revolution, French physician Philippe Pinel took over the Bicêtre Insane Asylum and forbade the use of chains and shackles, a rather progressive step for treatment. But elsewhere, things were still looking grim. Bedlam Institute, the first asylum for mentally ill in London, was infamous for their mistreatment of patients. For 1 penny, onlookers could visit the asylum and poke patients through their cells with wooden sticks. Such conduct in asylums encourages us to ask whether this type of facility could be considered a place where real treatment or torture occurred. Stigma can take on a multitude of definitions, but most concretely, it is a negative evaluation of a person as tainted or discredited on the basis of attributes. Essentially, when one is stigmatized, they are ascribed with the mark of disgrace and deemed to have deeply discrediting attributes. Stigma affords a normal, and when one is attached to a stigma, he or she is seen as deviant to this normative ideal. Those who are in vulnerable positions are often the most susceptible to stigmatizing behaviors. This includes, but is not limited to, homosexuals, people of certain ethnicities, people with physical disabilities, people who misuse drugs, and people who suffer from mental illness. We are focusing exclusively on the stigmatization of mental illness in this course. Irving Goffman further defines stigma as an attribute that is deeply discrediting and an undesired differentness. People are stigmatized because they have a deeply discrediting attribute that is particularly undesired. This leads to a discrepancy between what they are and who they are perceived to be by society. Goffman identifies 3 prevalent types of stigma: those of race and religion, those relating to an individual's character, and those of physical imperfections of the body. The central idea, however, is that those who are stigmatized are discriminated against and not seen as fully human. According to Goffman, people can either be discredited or discreditable. Those who are discredited are defined to be evidently and visibly different, while those who are discreditable have differentness that may be concealed or not as outwardly apparent. Those suffering from mental illness deal with both of the degrees of stigma on varying levels, depending on the specificities of their illness. In 1994, Anne Jacoby drew a distinction between felt and enacted stigma with her stigma scale. Felt stigma refers to tangible episodes of discrimination against the person being stigmatized. An enacted stigma is the stigma which is perceived by the person being stigmatized. It is active discrimination against people with mental illness. Enacted stigma can involve the loss of job opportunities, negative reactions from close friends and loved ones, and may also take the form in a more subtle, patronizing attitude. Both may occur regardless of whether or not a person feels any sense of personal shame or inferiority. Stigma may also be felt in the absence of any direct discrimination and may critically affect disclosure. It may not be possible for some people to conceal that they have a mental illness, but the key issue for the many who can is how to manage how much they disclose to the people around them. For the last portion of the lecture, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the definition of mental health, as this is crucial to understanding how stigma plays a role in exacerbating the effects of mental illness. Firstly, the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well being, and very important to note, not merely the absence of disease. This means that someone who is unwell may not have physical manifestations of their illness, but is still considered to be sick. For this cause, mental illness refers to the mental component of an overall experience of health. It is further defined as a state of well being in which every individual can realize his or her own potential, cope with the normal stresses of life, work productively and fruitfully, and make a contribution to his or her community. It is important to note that everyone has mental health, just as everyone has health. It is a state of ill mental health that leads to a mental disorder and puts individuals into an outstanding category. And what is not a mental disorder has proven to be difficult, as there is no definition that precisely defines the borders of a mental disorder. For the purposes of this course, we will define a mental disorder as a wide range of conditions in which mental health is compromised. I know this is a broad topic, but it is critical to include elements of mental illness which might otherwise be compromised in a narrow definition. That being said, we must be careful to include exclusion criteria within this range. Mental disorders cause distress or disability. However, this is not due to medications, substances, or another medical condition. There are many different types of mental illness. This course is primarily concerned with mental illnesses under the umbrellas of anxiety, mood, and psychotic disorders. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, shortened as DSM-5, is a manual put together by the American Psychiatric Association. It has 20 different categories in which mental disorders are classified. According to the National Institute of Health, about 25% of Americans will meet the criteria of a mental illness each year. So, mental illness is a very common problem and a leading cause of disability. There is a link posted for a Khan Academy video which further explores the 20 categories of the DSM-5. Please watch this in your own time. Research has shown that mental disorders find their sites of origin in a combination of biological, genetic, psychological, and environmental components. We can break this down further by looking at the biomedical and biopsychosocial structures of our beings. The biomedical model focuses on the physical abnormalities of mental disorders. It advances that mental disorders are in fact diseases of the brain, which need treatment targeted specifically at physical biological abnormalities. These brain diseases are caused by chemical imbalances, which can thus only be chemically treated with drugs. When we talk about the biological components of mental disorders, we are referring to genetics or inherited traits, environmental exposure before birth, and brain chemistry. The biopsychosocial model also considers the biological basis of mental disorder, but it focuses more concretely on the psychological and social elements of mental illness. This model, proposed in the late 20th century, offers a different, more progressive way of theorizing and understanding mental illness. It is not solely biological factors that play a role in what causes mental disorders and what determines treatment for them. When we talk about the psychological factors concerning mental disorders, we can look at events such as severe psychological trauma suffered as a child, a loss early on in life, neglect, and the inability to relate to others. Social and environmental factors around this topic include death, divorce, dysfunctional family life, substance abuse, and the stress of cultural expectations.
The brain allows us to perceive the outside world, but it has a trick. It can make us think we're experiencing reality, even when we're not. You've probably realized this when looking at visual illusions. For the most part, your brain has been good to you. You can trust it. But imagine, you're taking a walk when you start to hear whispers. You look around and begin to feel scared. You feel like you're in danger, but you're not sure why. You try to find somewhere that feels safe, but you can't. You wonder why others aren't also afraid, and you wish someone would help you. Maybe this happens a few times. You start losing trust in your own senses, in your own brain. But everyone around you thinks you're on drugs, or worse, they think you're making it all up. They think you should know the difference between what your brain is telling you and reality. You don't know what to do. Even though you're trying your hardest, you just can't make yourself act like everyone else. You want to, more than anything, but everyone thinks you're just not trying hard enough. This is Susie, and that's Steve. They have something in common. They both have mental illness. What comes to mind when you hear those words? What assumptions do you make? The definition of mental illness is a wide range of conditions that affect mood, thinking, and behavior. Doesn't tell you much, does it? Mental illness can produce a huge range of symptoms. However, in our society, we often make assumptions about individuals with mental illness. For example, we assume they're less intelligent, so we treat them differently. We take away their choices, we take away their privacy. We assume we won't have a good conversation with them, so we don't even try. We assume they're violent, so we're afraid of them and avoid them. We assume they should be able to recognize that their reality, their perceptions are incorrect and change them. So we look down on them because of their confusion. We assume that somehow it's their fault, that they brought it on themselves, so we lack empathy and love. Most of all, we assume that we won't like to be around them, that we can't learn anything from them, so we miss out on an incredible opportunity. So how can we create positive interactions with individuals with mental illness? Do not assume they also have cognitive disabilities or are less intelligent than the general population. In fact, many people with mental illness have above average intelligence. Do not assume they are more likely to be violent than people without mental illness. This is a myth. Each individual is different, and their behavior is related to each specific disorder. Some are more calm, some are more active, some may be in danger of hurting themselves. Definitely do not assume they brought it on themselves. Mental illnesses are caused by a combination of genetic, biological, psychological, and environmental factors. They are not a reflection of the person's character, and getting better isn't a matter of willpower. Basically, just do not assume. Treat them like anyone else, with respect, privacy, dignity, honesty, and love. Most of all, just enjoy who they are, right now, as a person.